You trust thought as your highest faculty. You believe that through reasoning, you arrive at truth. Every discovery seems born from a chain of ideas, so you assume thinking is the doorway to what is real. But Abdul al-Qadar asked a question that unsettles this confidence. Can thought ever transcend itself? He said that thought is confined within its own circle. Every idea points to another idea, but none point beyond the field of mind. To reach what is real, the circle must see its own boundary. Yet can the thinker perceive what lies outside the act of thinking? Abdul al-Qadar's method began with this challenge. The truth begins not where thought continues, but where it finally sees the continuation cannot reach the source it seeks. Across history, intellect has ruled as the highest judge. Philosophers and theologians trusted reason as the only path to certainty. Abdul al-Qadar did not deny reason. He exposed its hidden presumption. He observed that intellect can measure only what already fits its scale. It compares, defines, and concludes, but cannot grasp what precedes all comparison. When reason encounters what has no opposite, it falters. You begin to notice that every answer you form depends on definitions made earlier by the same mind. If the instrument defines its own evidence, how can it prove what lies beyond its design? Perhaps the limit of intellect is not failure, but its first glimpse of truth. You assume mastery grows through thought. The more you analyze, the more you feel in command. Yet Abdul al-Qadar said this confidence is captivity disguised as progress. Thinking repeats itself, promising resolution that never arrives. Each conclusion breeds a subtler doubt. The mind then constructs new explanations to hide its exhaustion. You mistake this motion for advancement. But what if control is only the mind preserving its own importance? Abdul al-Qadar taught that the intellect must one day see its limits, or it will keep polishing the bars of its own prison. The will to dominate thought keeps you inside the structure you wish to escape. Reflection appears. Noble, the act of turning inward. Yet Abdul al-Qadar distinguished between reflection that refines perception and reflection that feeds identity. When you analyze yourself endlessly, you build subtler forms of me. Observation becomes self-portraiture. True reflection ends when the observer recognizes the futility of observing itself. He said reflection is useful only until it reveals its own movement. Then it must rest. At that point, you begin to notice thinking as process, not content. The question arises, when reflection itself is seen, what remains that is not reflected? You construct systems, arguments, and proofs. Each feels complete until examined. Then another premise appears, untested but assumed. Abdul al-Qadar said that intellect must one day confess, I cannot go further. That confession is not surrender, but purification. It marks the instant when thinking stops claiming universal reach. In that recognition, thought becomes transparent. It witnesses rather than concludes. You realize that the most honest moment of intellect is when it stops pretending to hold everything. What begins when reason ends? Perhaps a form of knowing that does not require certainty to be real. Abdul al-Qadar described the restless mind as an endless rehearsal. It repeats the search for security within its own noise. You try to silence thought by effort, but effort is another form of noise. He advised not suppression, but understanding. When thought is seen as movement rather than truth, it loses its grip. Stillness is not the opposite of thought. It is the field in which thought arises and dissolves. In that stillness, knowledge no longer feels owned. Awareness remains without striving. You start to sense that silence is not emptiness, but the background, from which all meaning quietly emerges. When the noise settles, something unchanging becomes visible, not as an image, but as pure awareness. Abdul al-Qadar called it the hidden listener. It is not another thought, for it does not speak. It only knows. You notice that every idea appears and disappears within this unmoving witness. Even the thought of I is watched by it. Here, the need to control vanishes, because what observes is untouched by what it observes. The question arises, if every thought is seen, who is the seer? And can the seer be captured by any thought at all? Abdul al-Qadar warned that the ego adapts even to spirituality. It begins to own understanding. You may say, I know, or I have realized, but these statements rebuild the self that was supposed to dissolve. Knowledge becomes another identity. He said, genuine insight leaves no claimant. When realization is possessed, it dies into concept. You begin to see that the desire to be wise is subtler than the desire to be right. Both affirm a thinker separate from truth. Can wisdom exist where there is still an owner? Or must ownership vanish before truth can breathe? Now thinking continues, but without urgency. You notice it like weather passing through space. Abdul al-Qadar said that when the self no longer feeds on thought, the mind becomes transparent. Ideas rise and fall, yet none define you. What once felt like identity is revealed as repetition. This dissolution is not loss, but release. The end of unnecessary commentary. Awareness remains unchanged while everything mental moves within it. What you sought through thought is present before thought begins. Could this quiet presence be the truth that thought was unknowingly searching for? Abdul al-Qadar described a form of knowing that does not depend on concepts. It is direct, without subject or object. Here, awareness recognizes itself as the condition of all experience. It needs no argument, no evidence. You realize that to know, in this sense, is not to accumulate, but to awaken to what was never absent. This realization dissolves the divide between seeker and sought. Thought continues to appear, but it is known as appearance, not authority. The question that began the journey, can thought transcend thought? Now reverses itself. Perhaps transcendence occurs when thought returns to the stillness it came from. Thought returns, as it must, but its status has changed. It no longer claims to be the center. Abdul al-Qadar said that in true understanding, reason serves awareness like a tool serves the craftsman. You continue to think, speak, and act, yet none of it feels personal. Thought moves through clarity, not confusion. Its patterns are visible, its conclusions provisional. This is not the end of thinking, but the end of its tyranny. When mind acts without ownership, even ordinary reasoning becomes part of the greater stillness from which it flows. You see now that the mind was never an obstacle, only a misunderstanding of its place. Abdul al-Qadar's method did not seek to destroy thought, but to reveal its rightful limit. Thought exists within awareness, not apart from it. When this is seen, intellect becomes pure service. Truth was never hidden behind complexity. It was concealed by the urge to define it. When definition ends, recognition dawns, quiet, self-evident, complete. The thought that transcends thought is not a higher reasoning, but a transparent one, thinking that knows it moves within the real. What began as inquiry ends as recognition. Nothing new is gained. Only the noise of seeking has ended. The journey began with confidence in intellect and ends in its gentle humility. Through Abdul-Abdur's discipline, you move from assumption to awareness, from reasoning to recognition. Thought was examined, stripped of control, and returned to service. What seemed like transcendence turned out to be inclusion, thought seen as part of a greater awareness. This realization leaves no struggle, no division between mind and truth. The final understanding is simple. Thinking continues, but without possession. The real does not silence the mind. It places it back within its rightful order, calm, clear, and quietly free.